Hello and welcome to a special bonus episode of the Spouter-Inn. I'm Chris.
And I'm Suzanne, and we have a special treat to share with everyone today.
Yes, we do. So last episode, we talked about Christine de Pizan and her most famous book, The Book of the City of Ladies. And if you haven't listened to that episode yet, you might want to listen to that first, because now we're here in the Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library at the University of Toronto. And we're joined by Timothy Perry, the medieval manuscript and early book librarian here at the Fisher. Hello, Tim.
Hello, and thank you for inviting me along. I'm very happy to be here.
So we're really eager to talk with you about an exciting new bit of news that the Fisher has. I wonder if you could tell us about it.
Yeah, so we do have a very exciting piece of news. It's a new acquisition, and it's timed very well, although we didn't obviously plan this with your most recent episode for this podcast. It is a medieval manuscript, a late medieval manuscript of a work by Christine de Pizan.
Yeah, I was so excited to hear about this. And like you said, we didn't plan this. We had put together a cluster of 3 episodes on women writers, and we'd done the Christine episode, and then I got the good news that this acquisition had come in, and we've actually got the book before us.
We do have the book in front of us. It's a very handsome book, both inside and out, and I think the plan today is to go through it and have a look at some of its more interesting features.
Yeah, we were talking earlier about how one of the strange things is that we've got this object before us, but what we have is listeners, and so they can't see what we're looking at, though we can link to some images when the Fisher puts those online on our podcast page, episode page. But I wonder, can you just sort of describe the book, what it's like physically? Like if you were just looking at it, how would you describe it?
Yeah, so we'll start with the outside, I guess, and then we can work our way in. So it's in a very fine binding. The binding is actually much later than the manuscript, so the written text and the illustration, what have you, on the inside. So the manuscript dates from 1470, but the binding dates from the early part of the 19th century.
And that's an interesting story, too, in itself, right? When we talk about the provenance or the history of where the book has been over time, that's a neat little part of the story.
Yeah, and this one is particularly interesting because it was bound, we think, in 1818 in this binding. In 1817, it was proposed that the manuscript would be added to the collection of the King of France, the restored King of France, Louis XVIII. But for one reason or another, and I've not been able to find out why that fell through, so it was rebound. And on the spine, we have the fleur-de-lis, so the French royal symbol, and I think we have the monogram of Louis XVIII. So it was all going to go ahead, but then it fell through, and it got returned to the original owner in 1819. So it never actually ended up where the binding would suggest it. It ended up.
Because if it had done, it would have ended up in the French National Library, the Bibliothèque Nationale.
So yeah, it would have ended up in the Bibliothèque Nationale, where there is another manuscript of this particular work.
So we should probably say what the work is, because it's not a copy of the Book of the City of Ladies. It's one of her later works, I believe.
Yeah, so this is the Book of Peace, the Livre de Paix. It's one of her later works. I think it's usually considered her last major work. Or there are works that come after this, and it's a work of political philosophy. I guess you could say it's sometimes considered the third in a loosely connected trilogy of works on political philosophy. Not a part of her work that's maybe received as much attention, although I think now that's beginning to change.
Yeah, I think you're right. Like we talked about this a little bit last time, when we were doing our episode about the City of Ladies, that Christine writes these works that are kind of very literary, very vivid kinds of allegorical texts, like the City of Ladies. But she's also really engaged with politics of her day, kind of a public intellectual in some ways. And the Livre de Paix, the Book of Peace, is really a part of that conversation.
And Suzanne, you've read the Livre de Paix, the Book of Peace, before, correct?
Yeah, I haven't read the whole thing real carefully. I did work on one of the other books that are part of this trilogy, kind of that Tim was mentioning, the Book of the Body Politic. I've written about that one. And the Book of Peace is similar in some ways, in the sense that it's a very abstract general view of how society should be, the kind of highest ideals of virtue, prudence, and so on. But it's also a lot of very practical advice about what the people who are in positions of power might do in a time of tremendous political discord.
Is it as personal or literary constructed a work as the Book of the City of Ladies?
My sense is that it's a lot less personal. Like there's a lot of, I don't know, how can I put it? Not passion, deeply felt political concern, deeply felt concern for what's the state of society and what people can do to try to improve that. But it's not kind of at all autobiographical, personal in that way. What about you, Tim?
Yeah, and it is responding, I think, to a particular political situation.
Yeah.
There's civil war, certainly civil strife in France at the time. And she is, I think, responding very directly to that. So as you say, it's very politically engaged work. And it's written with a very specific person in mind in some ways. So it's written for and dedicated to the Dauphin, so the heir apparent to the French
It's addressed to a teenage boy.
Yeah, so it's
you know,
interesting.
Look at it another way, right?
He's a very powerful figure in some ways, potentially, although he hasn't really had time to show whether he can be the person that Christine hopes he will be and sort of maybe solve this civil strife. Unfortunately, we never get a chance to find out because he dies, I think, just a year or two after this work is written. So.
Yeah, it's a weird situation where he's a 15-year-old kid, right? He's the heir apparent to the crown. The king on the throne, Charles VI, often called Charles the Mad, right? He's someone who's incapable. And so there's all these factions that are struggling for control. And when the Dauphin is little, when he's a little kid, well, he doesn't really have a say. But as he's growing into manhood, he's right on the threshold of that. He becomes someone you could talk to. And one of the things she does that I find very touching is she talks a lot about his grandfather, Charles V, who had been an exemplary ruler, who had been the patron of her own father in the French court, where Christine's father, Tommaso da Pizan, was the court astrologer and physician to the king, advisor to the king. So she talks about the grandfather, about whom she'd already written a beautiful, long biography some years before. So it's kind of, so you asked about the personal, Chris, that I thought was a bit poignant when she's talking about the grandfather, because, I mean, it's not, how can I put it, it's a very public relation. This is the former king, but it's also a family relation.
And it's a part of her life, my understanding, that she looked back on growing up in the court of Charles V that she thought of as one of the, I guess, happiest parts of her life personally. So.
Yeah, no doubt about it.
So from just looking at the book from its outside, it looks a little larger than you might expect an average hardback copy of a book to look today. I don't know the exact measurements, but it's what, a foot by 8 inches, something like that?
Something like that.
And it looks like it's about 250 pages.
Yeah, although that's a little deceptive because of what it's made of. The leaves are made of parchment or vellum, so treated animal skins, and they're quite thick. And you can also see they're a little bit wavy. That's the sort of result of time, and yeah. So moisture and humidity will sometimes cause that. Obviously, we're going to keep it in very carefully controlled conditions. So it's not got as many leaves as perhaps as you'd think. I think it's got about 80 in total. But,
so 100.
So 150, 160. Yeah. So yeah.
It's got a very nice leather cover. It looks like, is that leather?
Yeah. So this is leather. It's been treated sort of decoratively. This is marbled calf. So it's got this sort of wavy pattern over the front and the back, achieved by treating the leather with acid, basically. So now we've opened the front cover. You can see it's got these marbled end papers, again, very decorative marbled end papers. This is all still part of the 19th century binding. It's also had some luxury owners, I guess. If you look here, we have the book label of Pierre Berger, so that's Yves Saint Laurent's partner. But getting into the manuscript itself, yeah, the reason we can tell, and I mentioned earlier that it's made of vellum parchment. It's quite thick. It looks sort of like old paper, but the texture is quite different, and you can hear if I turn the pages that it's quite sort of crinkly, sort of a sound that you get. But yeah, very nice wide margins. If we turn to a text page. All very carefully ruled up, and the ruling is still visible. This ruling in diluted red ink that was meant to stay there, so you could see it. So you could see how much care had been put into preparing the manuscript. We might be tempted to erase all of these signs that of the actual making of the book. In the medieval period, they're perhaps more inclined to leave those there to show that this has all been done very carefully. On some pages, you can just see some pricking, so some tiny little holes along the very outside edge of the page. And again, that's part of the ruling process. So they'll prick the very edge of the page in these very regular little holes, and they'll use those as guides to rule up the page. Yeah,
just looking at the columns of text, the regularity and exquisiteness of the ways in which this manuscript has been written out. I mean, when I think about the luxuriousness of it, that's one of the ways in which I see it. You know, the consistency of the hand, the careful pacing almost, right, of the writing.
Yeah, it's very carefully done, as you say. It's a very consistent hand. We think it's all by one scribe, and that isn't always the case with the medieval manuscript, but we think it is in this case.
And exquisite capitals.
And the capitals, I was just going to say, there's a large number of them, dozens of them, if you go through the whole manuscript, of these exquisite capitals with the gold illumination and
that lovely blue.
And the red and the blue colouring.
And this is something that you don't necessarily get to experience if you look at images, online scans of manuscripts. But wow, the light is just caught by those gold capital letters. They really pop in a way that I'm not as familiar with from pictures.
And it's also those little pricking marks that you mentioned earlier that are part of the ruling process. Those are things that you don't really, these are one of the ways in which the material manuscript gives us visual information that we don't get when we're looking online.
And even just the sound we were talking about, you're not going to get that sort of swiping through an online, a digitized version of manuscript. So
it looks like there are not a lot of corrections made to the text. Often in medieval manuscripts, you see insertion lines or reader marks.
Yeah, so not many that we can see, although it's possible. We were talking about this the other day. It's possible that there were more and they've been erased. The manuscript, it's possible, was cleaned up at some point. That would sometimes happen, especially in the 19th century, I think, when people are not as interested as we are now in how books were actually used and the marks left by previous owners. They would sometimes clean up the margins, in particular where people had written things in.
It's such an ironic thing that for the early 19th century, the value was in the cleaner the manuscript, the better. And now, while we still value those, we are also very excited by marks from readers. That tells us something about how a text was taken in.
And speaking of the margins and how the I guess the overall impression that you get from looking at these pages, and talking again about the care that goes into making one of these manuscripts, you'll notice that on one particular opening, so 2 pages facing each other, you'll get 2 very light pages facing each other, and then if I turn the page, you'll get 2 much more yellow pages facing each other. That's going to be the hair side, the more yellow one, so the hair side of the animal that was made to make the parchment. They'll make sure that those 2 pages facing each other, you get the hair side facing the hair side. Then on the other side, it'll be the flesh side. Facing the flesh side. So again, just indicates the care with which they're putting it together.
And some of our listeners will be very familiar with manuscript culture, and when you say hair side, flesh side, they'll know exactly what you're talking about. Other listeners may not be so familiar with it. Can you very briefly describe what it is we're touching when we touch one of these pages?
Yeah, so this is parchment, this is vellum. So treated animal hide, so it's very organic
usually
product.
calfskin, I think.
Yeah, so calfskin is very frequently used, and some people will only use the term vellum for calfskin, and parchment's the sort of more general term. Other people, use them sort of interchangeably. But yeah, calfskin is certainly commonly used and gives you very high quality parchment. And obviously, we're dealing with an animal hide, an animal skin. It gets treated, so it's a quite a long process of stretching and washing and scraping off, obviously, the hair on one side and the flesh on the other side. But nevertheless, even though it's very carefully treated and prepared, when you look at the finished product, you can still see which side of the skin was on the outside of the animal, the hair side, and which side of the skin was on the inside of the animal, the flesh side.
That's the whiter side.
Yeah, so the whiter side will be the flesh side, and it also feels a bit smoother. And then the outside will be the yellower side, and they will carefully make sure that each individual opening, so 2 pages facing each other, match up very carefully.
And one of the fascinating things, too, about these parchment or vellum manuscript books is that, these books are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years old. But we are careful, obviously, when we handle something like this, but they're pretty durable. Manuscripts. I remember so well hearing an anecdote by one of our colleagues, David Townsend, about how when he was studying codicology, Father Leonard Boyle, who had been his instructor, would sort of slap manuscripts down on the table and would handle them quite roughly in ways that would shock the students. But what he was demonstrating is that these are tough material. This physical material. It lasts not forever, but for a long time. Yeah,
there are certain. Yeah, in terms of handling them, there are, as you say, they are surprisingly tough in some ways. So there are some things you can certainly do that won't damage the manuscripts. And vellum in particular, parchment compared to paper, is very hard to tear. I'd ask you not to put that to the test, but it is. You can trust me. It is quite hard to tear compared to paper. Of course, there are other things that manuscripts are very, very vulnerable to. So water, fire, changes in temperature and humidity, sort of climatic changes. But the materials themselves are actually surprisingly durable, surprisingly tough, and they do last really quite well.
Mm-hmm. So we were talking a little bit earlier about the history of the ownership here, how this volume was prepared for possible acquisition into the French Royal Library in the early 19th century, but then it stayed in private hands. And when we think about the history of the book, where the book has been, what kinds of adventures it's had, it's had a number of different owners, and most recently it was owned, I think you said, by Pierre Berger.
Yeah, so we have at the front of the book, so we've turned now to just the inside front cover, and that's where you'll often find information about previous owners. They'll often put book plates and book labels and write their name on the inside front cover or the first few leaves or on the title page. Medieval manuscripts don't really have title pages, so that's not really an option here. And yeah, we have a couple. We have a couple here. That, I've got this sort of red. It looks like leather, maybe. It's just someone's initials, sort of very elaborately done in gold on this red background. But then on the other side, we have the book label, so printed, just a little printed label with the name Pierre Berger, who was the partner of Yves Saint Laurent, who owned this manuscript.
Did he own a lot of medieval manuscripts?
I think he did have quite a collection of art more generally. I don't know a lot about his collection, and I believe he also founded an auction house. So he was certainly in that world. I don't know how many medieval manuscripts in particular. I don't know if that was a particular thing that he was interested in, or whether this one just happened to catch his eye. Again, that's something that could certainly be looked into.
It makes me think about all the different kinds of value an object like this has. Like there's a kind of an academic value, research, scholarly value for people who want to know more about the history of the text and who read it and so on. But then also there's just a beautiful luxury object value that's also undeniable.
Well, and also an art value, because although it is not a lavishly illustrated manuscript in that sense, it does begin with a perfectly nice painting.
I was just thinking about that. The opening illustration is really quite stunning, isn't it?
Yeah, so it does have, it's not a richly illustrated manuscript in terms of the number of illustrations, but it does have this stunning first page,
Yeah, it's an illustration of the author, isn't it?
So yeah, we have here an illustration of the author, of Christine de Pizan, and she is shown kneeling in front of the Dauphin, so Louis, who she's dedicated her work to, and she's presenting him with a copy of the book, a copy of her work,
with a few, courtiers around, and a very charming white dog.
Yeah, the dog doesn't look too interested in what's going on. The dog looks like it's fallen asleep, but yeah, it's very nicely executed.
But the dog is often a symbol of fidelity and faithfulness, right? So it's kind of doing some double duty there, right? There might really have been a dog there, but it's also kind of symbolic. And we talked in the podcast episode last time about how Christine de Pizan was very dedicated to kind of supervising her own manuscript production. And these presentation images where she's actually handing a copy of the book, that is, you, the reader, have this book in your hand, but she's also showing you her giving the book to the person for whom it was primarily meant. Here, the heir apparent Louis. And those are just really interesting, I think, sort of symbolic moments. Like, this is not the actual presentation copy, but this image is presumably modeled after what would have been in the original presentation copy, which we don't have anymore. We only have 3 manuscripts, one of which is early, a manuscript that was supervised by Christine, produced by Christine's atelier, her workshop, but not the presentation copy. And then 2 later copies, this one and one that's in the French National Library, right?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting that, as you say, this copy has this scene showing her presenting her book to Louis, because this is 40 years after she's died, so she's not really involved, obviously, in making this copy and making sure that the presentation of the book is shown there. I think it shows an interesting relationship between the text and the image. Often, if we're going to put out a new edition of a book, we think of the text, or put out a new edition of the text, but we might not think, well, we have to keep the same illustrations as were in it before. Whereas this one, it appears that the manuscript that it was copied from, and one of the other manuscripts that survives, which also has this presentation dedication scene, it appears that they were copied from a manuscript which perhaps was the original presentation copy, and because that manuscript had this scene, then when they made the new manuscript, they copied out the text, but they also just kept the illustration.
Yeah, well, that was important to them in some way, maybe. Remembering that moment of political counsel for whoever these manuscripts are made for, maybe that was important to have that scene there.
If I remember correctly from reading a little bit about this manuscript, we know the artist of this miniature?
We do. His name was Jean Encart. He was a fairly well-known artist from Flanders. So he's working for the Burgundian court. And we know of, I think, 3 manuscripts that have his miniatures. The other 2 manuscripts each have 3 miniatures of his, including in each one a similar scene, a dedication sort of presentation scene, and then a couple of other miniatures. So we have, I think, 7 total miniatures of his in manuscript. And we also know that he was doing other sorts of work. So he was painting banners and that sort of thing, more ephemeral.
I find that so fascinating, that I always used to assume that people who were doing illustrations and manuscripts, that was the thing they did. But some of these artists, at least, as you were just describing, were also involved in doing, I don't know what you want to call it, public art for the court. I mean, more ephemeral kinds of art.
Yeah, and he's. It's also worth noting when we're looking at these, and we talked a little bit about this in terms of earlier manuscripts having similar scenes. He's not necessarily just imagining the scene and painting it out. He's going to be modelling this on other manuscripts. In this case, it seems that the text was copied out from one manuscript. And they decided they'd keep the same style of illustration, the same topic, this dedication, but the dedication is actually based on a dedication scene in another manuscript. So there's an interesting sort of network of all these different books that are being drawn upon to make this particular item.
I think it's also difficult for modern viewers of medieval manuscripts to look at an image like this in a book and divorce that from how contemporary books are illustrated. The idea of this mass production, the idea that, well, of course, there's an illustration in a book. You're familiar with that. These really are paintings. These are paintings as much as a painting that might be hanging on a wall, and they require, in some cases, as much craft. I mean, these faces are very well done.
And at a tiny little scale. Imagine what kind of brush you need to do that.
Exactly. It's just detailed.
And even the borders. I love looking at these decorative borders.
So the idea of looking at this presentation page as you might look at a piece of art, it took a while for me as I was in grad school learning about manuscripts to really start thinking, oh no, this is something else. This is, or it is something familiar. It is a painting rather than just, quote unquote, just a book illustration.
Yeah, and it's certainly one of the things that attracted us to this manuscript in terms of acquiring it for the Fisher Library. The fact that it does have all of these different aspects that you can look at. You can look at. I mean, we've talked about the binding, we've talked about provenance, we've talked about the text itself. There are only 3 manuscripts of this particular text, so it's a very important witness. As we say, to the text. But then there's also, as you say, this art historical aspect as well. And there are all sorts of different ways of looking at them. You can look at this miniature sort of in its own right, but of course you can also relate it to the rest of the book and to other miniatures. And so there's just so much potential in terms of research and teaching. And there's so much you can do with an item like this.
It's participating in so many different conversations.
Well, let's go back to that idea of what does it mean that the University of Toronto, the library, has acquired it now, that it's out of private hands. Was the previous owner very good at letting scholars have access to the text? Did scholars know that the text existed in the way that now that it's at a public institution, it'll be much more accessible for scholars and much more well-known, I imagine?
They certainly did know. It has been known for a while that this manuscript exists. I think there have been 2 critical editions. One was in the 50s, based only on 2 manuscripts, and then one in 2008, which was based on 2 manuscripts, but knew of this manuscript.
Exactly, yeah. It's kind of interesting. There's a very early edition of it. In fact, it was one of the very first works of Christine de Pizan to be edited in a professional scholarly edition in the 20th century in the 1950s by Charity Cannon Willard, who was a sort of grande dame of Christine studies. I remember meeting her when I was a very young graduate student at a conference. She was incredibly nice. And she wrote an article that signaled the existence of this 3rd manuscript. So she described it, I guess, perhaps at a time when it was changing hands, or whoever was owning it at that time made it available.
That tends to be the way it happens, yeah. So the points at which scholars have looked at this manuscript have been
when it changes
points at which it's been sold, and you also get at that point auction houses and booksellers describing the manuscript as well. So.
Yeah, and so that 2008 edition talks about this 3rd manuscript, but they didn't really have enough access at the time to really take it into account in that edition and translation. So presumably a new one will be in the works in order to really give an account of what this manuscript tells us about the work and its transmission over time.
Yeah, especially when you only have a very small number of manuscripts. If you've only got 2 and you add a 3rd. And there are some big differences between the 2 that scholars have looked at already. So there's some quite big textual differences. So obviously to have a third manuscript now that they can compare, that makes a big difference.
Well, one of the weird things about it, so of the 3 manuscripts, 2 are late 15th century, including this one that we have here before us. And one of them is, again, as you said before, a copy that was produced by Christine de Pizan herself. And not only produced, but also corrected in her hand, with her handwriting, which we can identify. And there's quite a long passage that's really very different, has a very different kind of political orientation compared to what you have in the other transmission of the text. So that tells you something about, I guess, again, that sort of hot, tumultuous political context of the time, where things were so fraught that both the production of the text initially and also the ways in which you might correct it subsequently is really responding to political realities on the ground. It's really neat.
I suppose it's also worth mentioning, in case people are less familiar with medieval texts, that it is not uncommon for a medieval text to vary quite dramatically from one physical manuscript of it to another one.
I mean, these are all written out by hand, right?
These are all written out by hand. Mistakes get introduced, but people also decide to make adaptations and changes to it, and then different versions of the manuscript float about. And so scholars will often try to make an edition, either representing one particular manuscript or trying to uncover what the quote-unquote original text might have been from the manuscripts that have survived and, as we say, witnessed the text.
Yeah, so and the 3 for this text are all very different. Yeah, so there's the original, if that sort of works in this context. There's the oldest one that we have that was produced by Christine in her own lifetime. And that has a very different miniature at the front. It shows her, I think, working at her desk in her study. And then there are these 2 later ones. And the 2 later ones are in some ways very similar. They both have this presentation scene instead of showing Christine in her office. But in many ways, they're very different. The other one is on paper, for a start. It's not on parchment. It seems to come from the south of France, a different part of France. So as you say, they are all very different. The third one is also part of a composite manuscript. So it's got 3 or 4, I think, different works, including City of Ladies. Yeah, so it's also in there. So all very different. Yeah.
So this is a very exciting acquisition for Fisher, for U of T. And is this you haven't been working at the Fisher for very long? Is this the first big get that you've been involved with here?
Yeah, so I've been working here since October. I mean, I'm familiar with the Fisher from my previous studies at the University of Toronto. I was at the University of Toronto studying classics for a number of years. And at that time, I didn't really use the Fisher very much. The work I was doing didn't really require me to come to the Fisher. Not that you need an excuse to come to a library like the Fisher. But then I came back and did my professional library degree, also at the University of Toronto. And for that degree, I really did make a lot of use of the Fisher. And I was wondering why I hadn't used it more when I was doing my work in classics. And although in some ways I'm kind of glad that I didn't use it, and then I did use it because it made me really appreciate how much more I got out of my studies when I was using it. In any case, so I'm familiar with the Fisher more generally, but I've only been working at the Fisher since October. This is the first major manuscript acquisition that I've been involved with. Not long ago, we did acquire a very early printed text by Caxton, and I wasn't here for the acquisition, but I was here when it was sort of unveiled and presented to some of the people that made that acquisition possible. But yeah, this is really my first major manuscript acquisition that I've been involved in.
I assume that you and everybody else at the library are very excited about this.
Oh, we are very excited. Yeah, we're very excited about this. I mean, as I said, there's only 3 copies of this particular work. This was, as far as we know, one of 4 copies of any of Christine de Pizan's works in private hands. And it's really only the ones in private hands that are going to come up on the market.
Because once they're in big collections, they never come up again.
Yeah, once they're in institutions, it's very, very rare that an institution will decide to sell an item like this. So it's such an important text, such an important writer. They don't come up very often. So yeah, we're thrilled to have been able to get it.
There are not a lot of major. I mean, thinking about women writers, which is a context that we were thinking about in our last podcast episode. I'm really happy to have one of Christine's manuscripts here in Toronto.
Yeah, I think the only other place you'll find them are really quite major institutions. The Bibliothèque Nationale and the Royal Library in Brussels, and the British Library, sort of institutions like that, and major academic libraries. There are, I think, a few Christine de Pizan manuscripts in North America, in the US, but as far as I know, this is the only one in Canada. Of course, we don't know exactly where those 3 remaining ones in private hands are, but as far as we know, this is going to be the only one available to the Canadian public. So.
Coming back to, we were talking earlier about the physical manuscript, the sound of the pages as you turn them, the things that you see when you're looking at the manuscript in person, as opposed to what a digital image gives you. When you think about the presence of the manuscript at the Fisher, like in real life, in the flesh, so to speak. What's the value of that? Why is that important that we have? Somebody might say, well, isn't it enough just to have the digital images? Why do you need to have the actual physical book itself? What is that giving us that's different?
So, it gives us a lot of added value over a digital image. Obviously, digital images.
These are really important too.
Yeah, they serve a great purpose. In terms of providing access to materials, all sorts of people can access an item like this.
And you can study things side by side, right?
Yeah, in all sorts of interesting ways digitally, and do all sorts of interesting things with digital versions. Who wouldn't necessarily be able to come and see the item sort of in the flesh, as it were. But there are all sorts of things you can't do with the digital version as well. We've talked about some of those physical aspects. You don't get a sense of the size of the item, something as simple as that. Often when you're dealing with digitized versions, you don't get a feel for the materials it's made of. There's certainly certain things you can't see in a digital version. This manuscript is quite tightly bound, so if you can really get into the gutters, so and the inside margins of the text, and try and work out exactly how the book was put together, the sewing structure and all that sort of thing, which is the sort of thing scholars are increasingly interested in, those physical aspects of the text. You can't do that with a digital version. There is also that aura, Benjamin calls it the aura, that you get from dealing with a text with an item like this in the original, in the flesh. There's nothing quite like walking into a classroom or an exhibition and actually handling an item like this that's 400, 500, 600 years old, and just seeing the effect that has on people. That's very hard to replicate with the digital copy.
I know that what makes possible this kind of acquisition is it's partly the institution itself, but partly it's friends, donors, the larger community that helps to support these acquisitions. Have you been in the situation of having to kind of make that case to talk about why it's important to have it here? What are those conversations like? Yeah,
we're very lucky to have very good support from the university, from the Central Library Administration, when it comes to making this sort of acquisition. But obviously you do have to make a case for this sort of purchase. But so we're constantly having those conversations within the Fisher, prioritising what we want to acquire, but also having that conversation beyond the Fisher with the Central Library Administration, with the academic community, members of the public, because we do make these items available fairly broadly. And we will talk about, when we're justifying this sort of purchase, we will talk about just those sorts of issues that we've looked at. There's the importance of the text and the writer, but also the importance of the physical object and all the things you can do with the physical object that perhaps you can't do if you only have digital access, or obviously no access at all in some cases if these items are in private hands. We're tremendously grateful for the support that we do get.
I can tell you what my favorite thing about this book is. I'm curious to know what your favorite thing is. My favorite thing is that this is the work in which Christine de Pizan alludes to a now lost work. We know that she wrote a work called The Vision du Coq, the Vision of the Rooster, because she talks about it in the Book of Peace. For me, that is like the most tantalizing thing. I remember running across a reference to that when I was early on in graduate school, and I was like, before I die, I really hope that book shows up, because it's just so tantalizing to imagine what she might have done in it. So for me, that's the most titillating, exciting thing about this work. For you, either the work or the physical book itself, what's the thing that most enchants you?
Obviously, it's quite hard to get past the magnificent miniature at the front, and the border around it, and the illumination of that, the initial very large initial G with the coat of arms of the person who had this particular copy made. And it's such a wonderful visual experience just looking at that page. But getting beyond that, I guess, into the text itself, one of the features of this particular work and of this particular manuscript, while this particular manuscript handles it a little bit differently, is that each of the chapters begins with a quotation. From my understanding is that the other manuscripts, those quotations are kind of in the margins, they're marginalized, whereas in this manuscript, they're actually incorporated into the main columns of the text. And my background's in classics, and a lot of these quotations are from classical authors. So I was fascinated, just sort of flicking through the pages and looking at the beginning of each chapter, just the range of authors she's drawing on. Some medieval, but many classical, and many biblical as well. But yeah, as you say, Ovid's in there, Seneca, Cicero. A lot of quotations from Proverbs and the Psalms. Not all of them are 100% accurately attributed, probably because the sources she's drawing from, anthologies and that sort of thing, they're not accurately attributed there. But just look at the range of classical learning and other types of learning that she draws upon. That was, I guess, of particular interest to me because of my background in classics.
Neat.
Excellent. Well, it was terrific to be able to spend some time looking at this manuscript. It's a great addition to the library, and I'm glad it's here in Toronto to be a resource for anybody who wants or needs to look at it.
Yeah, thank you, Tim, for telling us about it. It's really amazing.
Well, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. It's been great.
If any of our listeners would like to get in touch with us, as always, you can email us at spouter@megaphonic.fm, or we're on Twitter @thespouter. We'd love to hear from you. Show notes with links to things we've mentioned in this episode, including images of the manuscript itself, will be available at megaphonic.fm/spouter/4b. And the Spouter-Inn is one of the fancy little podcasts over at Megaphonic FM. So until next time.
Until next time, please make sure to join us again at the Spouter-Inn.